This question, I guess, is for the morning session participants. We have a company now called Metaverse, or Meta, and they are talking about Metaverse and things of that nature. So I'd like to, for those of you that participated in this morning session, to comment on what that means for your area. Especially around, I think, Ms.
Petrick,
yeah. I think your topic was very interesting to see how that applies, because I can see a lot of applications there.
Yeah, there's, so I assume you're referring to the kind of virtual reality interests of them? Yeah. In that, there is a lot of interest there, particularly for people with disabilities. I had a student, I think this was before I came to Rice, who was doing there's been a virtual reality community now for a few years. I can't think of the name of the software, but it was one of the early ones to launch. That it was basically the equivalent of Second Life, but in VR. And one of the things he told me about, he had been experimenting with this software, is there was a girl in his friends group who I think might have had epilepsy, and it was interesting that they could tell when she was having a seizure that something was wrong through virtual reality and how her avatar was reacting. And so there's this great interest in the technology for people with disabilities. You know, it's another way to participate socially that isn't completely embodied. It's not face to face, but it is maybe more embodied than other kinds of technology, maybe more embodied than social media we have today. So there's this huge interest in a lot of people with disabilities in using that technology and the possibilities that it opens up. And we're already seeing this kind of, even in these early examples, of people embracing the technology. I don't know where it's going to go from there. Historians are bad at predicting the future, but so I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go, but there is great interest.
Anybody else would like to comment on the multiverse?
I'll quote Behnaam and say, we don't know yet when it comes to personnel selection. I don't think the vendors haven't necessarily gone toward VR, but I did want to comment on how VR could be a way to accommodate those with disability, in a sense, if it were sensitive to the environment and you had, a work-relevant scenario where the disabled, where everyone, right, could be included in and assessed. But it also could be problematic, right, because those who are disabled may not have the psychomotor skills necessary to navigate the scene and get the score they need, or things like that. And so in the traditional vein of personal selection, there's been accommodation, right? Extra reading time. When you're not assessing reading, then as what you want to measure for selection, then it's job irrelevant, right? So if there's a reading demand and you want to accommodate through extra time, that's fine, right? If, large print, et cetera. That's easier than accommodating for VR and complex games, right? How do you create an equivalent test or an equivalent score for a VR equivalent if someone disabled can't complete that assessment, right? So that will be a challenge. I think that's already going to be a challenge with gamification.
Let me add, there's a really interesting interplay. As somebody who studies human settlements and what urban planners call the built environment, there's a really interesting interplay between the metaverse and the real world, right? When you are operating in VR, you either have a fake place created for you, or you create one that you like yourself. And so one question to me, two questions arise. One is, will that help us understand what kinds of built places people really like, rather than having to choose from the rather limited selection of built places we give them in the real world? And will that help us understand what people want? But the other one is, will that make the texture and experience of being in the real world more important to people, right? In other words, you might spend a lot of your time in a fake world, and that might be very stimulating and you might like it, but is there something about being back in the real world that becomes more important to you? And does this sense of being in the middle of a real human settlement or a real built place become more important to you or not? I think those are really interesting questions for urban planners to consider going forward.
But if I can comment, there is the aspect that goes back to your talk, Bill, about the importance of being there. So we all have now used Zoom for a few years, and it's incredibly functional. I mean, if you think about the pandemic experience, I would say two technologies really made a dramatic impact. One is the really warp speed vaccine on one hand, but the other one is Zoom or some other programs like that, or Google Meet, Team, whatever. But the ability for most knowledge workers, the ability to continue to work without being there was just crucial to save our economy. But on the other hand, we all found it was very unsatisfying. I mean, take this conference. We're adamant we will not just have another Zoom conference because it's not like being there. And the question is whether virtual reality can take us to a place where we can be remote and it would feel more like being there. Okay?
Yeah, it's still fake but more real.
How much real do we need to do? Okay? How good a fake does have
How
to
real can it be?
be? How real is reality?
Yeah.
And I
How
think
real does it have to be? Now, if we have something that will, that you can simulate a faculty meeting, and we will feel as if we're being there, then it will be, the motivation, the stickiness of location
Right.
will diminish. And so the problem right now to me with people ask, what is the metaverse for? The answer was because Facebook has a business problem, so they need something else. But if you take virtual reality and you say, what problem are we trying to solve? And you could do good things with it if you make it a human-centered technology instead of profit-centered technology.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting because, and this gets back to the point I was saying about it being more embodied than our other computer technologies. That was the thing I found so frustrating about Zoom is it didn't enable bodily communication really well. Having that little square of people to look at just wasn't enough to see things like body language, assuming they even have the video on at all. And I'll be curious to see where virtual reality goes with that. Does virtual reality enable us to have that kind of bodily communication that is more satisfying?
Well, and if I can just, will it be authentic?
Yeah.
Because you don't have to be you in virtual reality, right? So you're like, we could have a faculty meeting, but who's showing up to the faculty meeting? Is it your avatar, who could be a completely different you? Or is it you? So I think it's sort of, the authenticity of that interaction also is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
I would say dryly that a VR faculty meeting is as good as a real faculty meeting.
Possibly
but,
better.
VR does afford some things, right? In terms of trying out different personas, or in terms of like in the workplace, if you can engage in VR training where there's some risk and therefore it's safe, right? Virtual welding or mining. I've been in a virtual mining team scenario where you're rescuing somebody and it'd be treacherous in real life, and you can overtrain for that as opposed to in the real world where you might only be able to do that once as training, that kind of thing. So there are some promising options as well.
Bill? Sorry?
Yeah, actually, you partially answered the question I wanted to ask, which is I came here this morning very happy and was looking forward to learning about technological innovation that would continue my happiness. But through the course of the day, I've gotten very scared by you people for all the limitations of technology and the lack of promise in some ways for critical problems. So if each of you could maybe give me one good example from each of your fields which will make me a little happier, I can go home and have a nice meal and so forth. Actually, I have heard, things that made me a little happy today, but I'd, at the end of the day, I'd like you to each reflect a little bit on what it is that you've been thinking about or talking about that would make me less grumpy, which is actually an impossible task, but a little happier, all right?
Nobody wants to go first.
Start at either end.
I can jump in. So, a lot of my work studies the history of human-computer interaction and the history of interactivity with computers. And I think the thing I would say is good about that is the way it's increased over time. The way that computer technology has become much more intimate, much more personal. There's definitely bad things that happen because of computers becoming much more widespread. But that level of intimacy and ability for humans to connect with the technology, I actually think is really interesting. And there's a lot of potential there in terms of what we can do with it.
So in terms of promises, I do think it's worth, again, these distinctions I raised in my comments about keeping technology distinct from data, from algorithms, from decisions, and so on. And so when you kind of cross that with where's the promise of this, I don't know. I guess the one I'll pick for now is the real-time aspect of interactivity with technology that you don't get through traditional assessment. And so even though I emphasize, is the test reliable, is it valid, et cetera, there's something to be said for a measure that is also engaging. A game seems corny and, but if there were some reliability and validity and it was engaging might really matter, almost even to the point where you would give up some predictive power even if it meant that you could make a decision faster than an alternative where somebody who is more promising through the predictive model, if it takes longer and they're going to go away, you're not going to get any value out of that decision, right? So if it were up to that trade-off, you would take it. But I think the interactive nature shows some promise. I think in terms of new constructs, there's promise. So like when you think of people who are persistent or, you might ask people in a self-report, but that's very different from capturing that in an interactive environment where perhaps the algorithm side of things could track and extract useful information about that. Not necessarily, selection is not necessarily deterministic. You might say, look, this person, here's where they're at. They might have needs. They may not be the most persistent, but I know where they're coming from, and I know more than I did in a traditional testing setting.
So, love this question, thank you. I'll say what I believe, which is I think technology is non-normative. I don't think that it's good or bad. So the technology itself should not make you grumpy. And I think what I heard from most of the talks and what I was certainly trying to get across in my talk is it's the human behavior that gets overlaid onto the technology that determines whether it's good or bad. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity from a human behavior perspective. There's incredible medical advances that are being made, catching criminals and deterring, really atrocious behavior, I think is a really good thing. So there's lots and lots of really positive things that I think all of the technology advancements can lead to. There's also potential pitfalls and dangers, and that we as a human society, I think, have to determine how we're going to really capitalize on the good and try to prevent as much as possible the bad.
I'll give two answers. The first one is to go back to almost the last slide I gave and I showed, and it said, we gather together in cities or human settlements now because we want to, not because we have to. And I think one of the things that technology has done for us, not just during the Zoom era, but over the last several decades, is allowed us to see when in-person interaction is important and when it's not. And I think that's a good thing. That's better than being forced to be together all the time, which is the way people used to be, or sort of voluntarily atomizing, which is what happened in the suburban era. So I think to being able to understand when it is okay to be alone and we don't need other human interaction, and when we want to be together and how that enriches our lives, and how, from my point of view as an urban planner, human settlements help to enrich our lives, that's a really good thing. The other point I want to make, I want to play off of Amy's presentation in a kind of a funny way. I thought of this when you were talking. As many of you know, I lived for 25 years and was the mayor of Ventura, California. And in 1980, there was a gruesome double murder in Ventura. A prominent lawyer and his wife were killed in their bed. That created a sense of unease, and that murder was never solved. That created a sense of unease in the community for 40 years. The assumption was that the jealous ex-wife had killed the ex-husband and the second wife, the new wife. But no one ever could really prove that until it was proven that it was the Golden State Killer. And that created that created a sense of everyone exhaled when they learned that this community, which had held on to this murder, for this gruesome double murder for so long, now had an answer because of the kind of work that Amy does, which was not possible in the past. That murder never would have been solved, and everybody would have continued to feel uneasy. So on behalf of my former constituents, I want to say
And the
thanks.
ex-wife in particular, I assume. I'm sure she exhaled the most.
So, yes, the ex-wife, right. So on behalf of my former constituents, I want to say thanks, because I think that's an example of an answer that technology gave us that we never could have had before, that had, from my point of view as an urban planner, significant positive benefits to a community, knowing an answer to a question that had plagued them for many decades.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Amy said. I mean, the scientists who came up with gene therapy are amazing.
Yes.
They're doing astounding work, and it's drug company executives that are taking advantage of it. You know, I told you I'm spending a lot of time working on hospital prices because due to government regulation, the insurers were required to dump all of the prices they've negotiated with everything with hospitals for every condition, and they've done it, and it's over 100 terabytes of data, and it's a mess. And so there's a group of economists from all over the country who are working to parse this, and so one of them is a Harvard health economist, and he went to, they've got this Center for Computing and Biosciences or something like that, and he said, I've got this file, I have no idea how to figure out, you know, what price for what hospital with what insurance plan and for what disease. And so he gave it to them, and they used artificial intelligence, and they're actually going to be able to make that whole file available to all of us, hopefully by spring 2023, in spite of the fact that there were, again, humans trying to make it impossible for us to be able to decipher the data. So, you know, and I don't know, I know nothing about AI, but I'm going to get access to this data, which is going to be incredible.
Just to complete the conversation, I'm kind of curious why you're grumpy. Okay, that's a different story. The reason is that when I heard my colleagues talk today, they really talked about data and a lot of research problems, saying this is hard or this is a still open problem. I think that's great. I think I am really, I talked about the same thing, that we have done a lot and we have so much more to do. And that's a good thing, because if there's nothing was left to do, then we'd be all out of business. I think of this as a very positive thing, that we have done a lot and we have a long ways to go. I think that's a good thing. Don't you agree?
I think one thing that strikes me as a sort of an overall theme is what I might call the tension between the personal and the statistical. So Amy, for instance, 23andMe said I had a high likelihood of going bald. And it's been shown that if you send in your DNA to several of those services, you often get different results. And I wonder about...
Sending until you don't get bored.
I wonder about the statistical being applied to the personal, and the way also sometimes statistics are viewed as absolutes rather than just tendencies or likelihoods, and how everybody feels about that.
Right, so yeah, I spent many years with every talk I did on genetics ending with genetic determinism, and how there's very, very few things, not nothing, but very few things in genetics that are completely, penetrant, predictive, et cetera. So I think it's really important to understand. And, I used to talk about genetics, I will say this is a positive evolution, right? I used to talk about genetics 10 years ago, and I could show 5 to 10 Time magazine articles that had the most ridiculous headlines, like, infidelity, it's in your DNA, religion, find out if you're religious based on your DNA, like things that were completely deterministic and not at all based in science. And now you see much, much more nuanced headlines, right? You see things like the epigenome, how it could change how your genome works, and like why environment matters, and things that are much more nuanced about like this is one piece of the puzzle, and it is not always true for the individual, and it's not always accurate, and sometimes it's predictive, and sometimes it's just tells you risk, and it doesn't tell you absolutes and things like that. So I think that I think you're right 100%, but I think the good news is, on the theme of good news out of this, I think the good news is that the population at large is starting to understand this better, and really sort of get the fact that it's not as deterministic as we might have once thought. So I don't think you have to worry about going bald, if you were.
Thank you all for interesting talks today. My question is about kind of what you just talked about, Amy, in terms of like engaging the broader public and thinking about like Vivian's talk. And I just want to thank you, Vivian, for doing this work, because I had some surgery this last summer, and I'm still trying to figure out my medical bills. It's like you can't make heads or tails of any of it, and you don't even have an expectation of what it should be. So everybody's very cynical, I think, particularly about healthcare and health and the cost of drugs and things like that. And so how do we engage, and even like genetic testing or even selection, personnel selection, taking tests for GREs, SATs, et cetera. So how do we engage, and worried about the effect of technology on all of these processes? So how do we engage the public to think about the good, and policymakers too, to think about the good, so that we can actually move forward in positive ways in some of these issues versus, just going down this quagmire of we can't even figure it out. So everybody's very cynical about politics now. So how do we engage these policymakers?
Well, so, gosh, I've been teaching health economics for 30 years, and then, I sit there and I look at the table of contents for the textbook, and I say, okay, I've got to cover this, the market perspective, and I've got to teach adverse selection and moral hazard, and risk and uncertainty, and then all this other stuff, and it was just itemizing. And then I sort of thought, when they go home at Thanksgiving and they talk with their parents and what they're saying, at the dinner table about healthcare, it's like, oh, you're taking a course in health economics. Well, the whole thing is it's all malpractice, and if we just got rid of the lawyers, we'd solve all our problems. Like, no, it's not that. So first of all, I've just changed my teaching, and I cover all the the stuff that's required, but I also start the class off and I give the 3 reasons why healthcare costs are so expensive. I say it's overly generous insurance at the point of care. I say that we reward for quantity and not quality, and that massive consolidation is leading to higher prices. And I say that multiple times throughout the class when I'm talking about a principle. I say, see, this is an example of reimbursing for quantity instead of quality. So I think we can do all of that in our teaching, that we think about what is it about the real world that we want our students to know. And then the other thing is we have to go out and talk to people. So I've been working, after this talk, then I worked really hard, because actually I'm going to get to go talk with TRS, the Teachers Retirement System, next Monday. and I'm going to be talking to them and explaining to them, this is why your health insurance is so expensive, and it's gotten so complicated, you know, as you said, and I'm sorry about your medical bills. But to say, this is, and I'm going to be showing them prices. It's like every time you go to Methodist Hospital, the price is twice as high as if you go to, you know, Baylor St. Luke's, you know, it's, and all these things. So we do have to go out and talk and educate the public, and, you know, I hope we can do more of that.
And as a former policymaker, I'd just say, if you can't write it on a whiteboard with a crayon, the policymakers won't understand what, you know. Unfortunately, you really do have to dumb it down as far as you can. And I think Vivian does a great job of I was saying this in the break, of simplifying and explaining a complicated topic as well as anybody does. Maybe not quite down to the crayon level, but pretty close.
Yes, you have a question?
So one thing that, I guess a theme that I'm finding a little bit in common from some of the talks is about, you know, to start off with research, you need the data, right? And there are some areas in which I think I heard through a couple of talks where some of that data is missing, or some of that data is either incomplete or is not compatible, especially when you're talking on a especially when you're studying things in an intersectional basis where it's not just one field. And so I'm kind of curious from you all about what data within your specific matter of research is missing. How do we collaborate to get that data? And yeah, and thoughts on making all of that possible.
From my perspective, it's all about data. I mean, the more data that you have, the better. We start and end with data. And it turns out that if you have a collaborator as a doctor, you have access to fresh data, the data that is all yours and your collaborators. But it turns out that there's tons of data out there on the web that they're some of them are very well documented, and that's a good starting point. And I think, you know, again, we start and end with data. I think getting your hands on the right type of data is very, very critical. And then that's a good thing.
I would say in my world, the issue which I alluded to is the creation by government agencies, municipal agencies, of what we call administrative data, which is data that is created for a specific purpose and then is needed by researchers and analysts for a different purpose. So in the world of urban planning and community planning, GIS data is tremendous, you know, mappable data is tremendously important. And it turns out that the single most important player in the data that we get for that kind of thing to understand communities is data from the assessor, from, in our case, the Harris County Appraisal District, which generates that data without thinking about why we might use it entirely, right? All they're trying to do is figure out how much property tax everybody should pay. That's the whole point of their life. And yet, in the process of doing that, they generate an enormous amount of data that is extremely important to everyone else, especially those engaged in mapping and GIS, to understand communities. And I've seen this over and over again, as I alluded to in my talk, where individual municipal departments generate data for their own purposes in order to run their own operations that are incredibly important to analysts and researchers, but are often not connected to each other and not very clean. I'll give you my favorite example from when I was at the Kinder Institute when Mayor Turner was first elected. I know this sounds very prosaic, but in his inaugural speech, he promised to fill all potholes within 24 hours. So he then asked us, he then claimed he was filling 96% of potholes within 24 hours. So then he asked us, well, can you prove that for me? So we said, okay, and then we had to merge to do this, we had to merge three different data sets that the city had that they had never merged. The intake data, the assessment of is it a pothole data, and the did we fill it data. And they had never done that, and we had to do that. And our conclusion was yes, within 24 hours, they fill 96% of all potholes that they decide are potholes that they decide they want to fill. But that took the merger of 3 completely independent data sets from 3 completely different city departments that didn't want to talk to each other to come to that conclusion. And in my world, that's an enormous obstacle.
I'll just say in the world of health, it's the same problem. You need interoperable, well-annotated data from diverse populations. And all 3 of those things are missing in some regard. And a lot of it's around sort of control and ownership issues. A lot of it's around sort of just the infrastructure's not there. I mean, there's a lot of sort of obstacles to creating that, but ultimately that's what we need to be able to kind of move forward with this.
And you have to have persistent researchers. This stuff is really, really tedious.
Yes.
I mean, while I've been sitting here listening to these talks today, I've been on the phone because we want to do a simple study. We just want to compare the hospital profits to the prices that the executives, the salaries the executives are receiving at each of these hospitals. And I'm emailing people all over the country. Do you have a crosswalk between EINs and Medicare provider numbers or American Hospital Association? Everyone's like, it's like, wow, I wish I had that. That would be really nice. And then, it's like, oh boy. And then people are sending me like information. Well, if I were going to do it, I'd do it this way. And, and so that's the really tough stuff you have to do to get the interesting questions answered,
Bill, I don't know if you remember when you came to Rice and Jan Odegaard and I took you to lunch, and we said it's all about the data. We kind of posed for the challenge for the Kinner Institute to create a dashboard of data. And it's still a challenge, I think, to gather the
Yeah, it's a real challenge. And one of the things that Kinder has done since I left is we did compile about 200 data sets or more about Houston, and Ruth's done a great job of getting that out onto the web now for anybody to use.
You have a question? Yeah, please.
I'm struck by how you're talking about data, as though if somebody coins something and says this is data, that one can believe it or understands it or knows the validity of it or the source of it. And data can be, the number may be correct for some purpose or some origin, but it may or may not be what the recipient understands it to be. And we don't tend to qualify data. We throw out and say, here's data, but is it valid? Is it on point? Is it specific to whatever the issue is that's being addressed? And yet, if we just coin it as data, many people will just assume that it's right and won't investigate it, won't think about it. What is the source of it? Is it applicable? So forth. Any comments?
I think what Amy said was important. Data better be well annotated. I think that's very, very critical. There are tons of data out there that are horribly annotated, and they're incorrect and all that. And the students, for instance, my students, look at the data, do some early analysis, and they say, this is garbage. That's it. You move on to the next data set. It's true. A lot of them are just garbage in, garbage out. You have to be very, very careful.
Yeah, you have to be very smart at how you validate your data sets. It's PhD students, they get the data set and the first thing they want to do is, okay, I'm going to estimate the regression and look at the coefficient. I'm like, no, how about starting with descriptive statistics and see if they make sense and look at the outliers? It's important, it's very important.
Yeah, your comment reminds me of maybe some, sound bites you hear in the press. The data say X, and behind that is a lot of critical thinking by researchers, hopefully, around the various aspects of data. So in my world and in others' worlds here, there's certainly thoughts about, what is your sample of people? what is your sample of, in my case, items for testing, right? Because there are many items you could be asking about conscientiousness, I kept mentioning as an example. Just because a vendor says it measures conscientiousness doesn't mean it does, and it doesn't mean there's a good process behind the development of the measure. How do you know? What samples did they use when they were checking out the qualities of this measure? So sampling people, items, time points, settings, the list goes on, right? There's a real framework you can think about when you think about what data are. And in fact, there's a kind of math model called generalizability theory that basically asks the researcher whether various facets, like the types of things I mentioned, are fixed or random, meaning are you committing to those exact items that you are using for a test, or is it sampled from a larger universe, and do your numbers need to account for that? You know, this is all art as much as it is science in some ways, but it suggests your question is taken seriously about examining what data is, annotating it so people you pass your data on to understand these kinds of important nuances, including your future self. 6 months from now, you're looking at your data again.
I have one final thought on that, which is from a policy perspective, there is sort of this shift in more data is good, right? More data is better. There's a lot of interest in AI. There's a lot of interest in open science. You've seen people kind of get crucified in publications who have said anything negative about sharing data. So it's sort of this cultural shift of like, we need more data, we need more data, we need more data. And as a result, there's been policies put into place to demand data access, like, you know, you have to make all your data available, blah, blah, blah. One of the things that we're finding in our research is that if people don't buy into that, like truly buy into it from I think this is a social good and I want to participate in that social good, they're submitting junk data. They're just trying to comply with the rules. And the more junk data we get out there, the more the noise sort of drowns out the good stuff. And so I worry a little bit about that from a policy perspective of how we're moving forward with making data more widely available without these safeguards in place.
One other comments, just because the data set was cited 1,000 times doesn't mean that it's not garbage. You got to read the paper to see if the authors complain about the data or admire the data. And that's very, very important. I think our students are very good at, deciding on that. That's again, another advantage of Rice students.
The famous phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think the same is probably true about data. Yeah, it's never quite right. I mean, the deep learning revolution, you all, I'm sure, have recently about deep learning, how about 10 years ago, suddenly we learned how to do machine learning and really do very good in image recognition, now in text processing. I don't know if anybody has played with the recent chat GPT. It's pretty amazing conversation you can have with it. And when you ask people what happened 10 years ago, well, machine was getting faster, and algorithms were getting better, but suddenly you had big data. And they started with images, and the images had to be tagged. You know, you need to know, is it a cat or a dog? So it used to be before, in the way back, that how do you get tagged images? You get your graduate students to tag them. But they don't like spending too much time. Any graduate students here, they don't like spending too much time tagging images. So you can have maybe thousands of images. And that was not good enough. Then there was something called Amazon Mechanical Turk, where people for very small fee would do this kind of jobs. And you can scale it to tens of thousands of images. Not good enough. And then somebody realized you can get the image set from Instagram. And people don't tag it intentionally, but they said, me and my dog, my cat's biting me, and things like that. So it's very noisy tagging, but it was never realized it was good enough. So now computers became very good at distinguishing between dogs and cats. So even if the data is not perfect, you can still do a lot with it.
There's a lot of similarities between models and data, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Back 40 years ago, engineers started with a model, and the models were always simple, linear, and all that, and they, they serve their usefulness, and now we start with data, and again, same problem exists with simple data or poor data and all that.
I'll ask the last question. I'm reminded of a quote by Ed Wilson, who said that the problem for us is that we have Paleolithic emotions and medieval institutions and technology of gods. And so I think kind of this is partly the answer to Rick. Yes, the technology is there, but it's how we use it and how our political institutions are reacting to it. What are the public policies that we're coming back to it? Now it's affecting us personally. That is the challenge for us, how we combine our political. For example, people now realize that to get likes on Facebook, give you a little dopamine injection because it's social approval, and we crave for social approval. So this was very cleverly designed to maximize user engagement. People put a picture and they want to see, okay, how many likes am I going to get? And that's what makes this technology addictive. So that's our Paleolithic emotions. So I just wonder if we can go around, each one of your perspective, comment on this quote and how it applies to, how do you see it applying in your area?
Could you repeat the quote?
He said, the challenge for us is we have Paleolithic emotions and medieval institutions and technology of gods.
Vivian?
I haven't thought of my response yet.
Okay. I haven't either.
We have to use our Paleolithic brains to think about the response to that, right?
Decipher that better.
I guess we are pushing it down the...
You've stumped the band.
Somebody wants to respond?
I might simply say that our Paleolithic emotions and human thoughts and human foibles in decision-making are wrapped around the context of the technology of maybe gods in developing AI within organizational settings. And that means that you have this decision-making of, which vendors to choose and which algorithms are right, and how are these decisions any good, and what is the value for the organization, and you're balancing the feelings about it that a vendor is telling you. You're trying to investigate through empirically as much as you can. You're weighing the politics and practicalities of the organization, which are very human as you make use of these tools. That's my best answer for now, is this mix is really important when you're putting these technologies into practice.
I think it applies to what you said in a discussion we had before about how people make decisions. So our Paleolithic emotions develop when life was very uncertain. And you go to a hunter-gatherer and you said, but if you do this, you may not live 30 years. And they look at you like, living 30 years? I mean, who's going to live for 30 more years? Okay? I'm trying to survive the next day. And so we are all engaged in hyper-discounting. Mm-hmm. So, should I have the cookie this afternoon? No, I probably shouldn't. But, the calories may help me survive the next day. So I did have a cookie.
I was just going to say that what Fred was saying was making me think that, one way that I can apply that quote is thinking about the place of discrimination in the kinds of cases that I study. That I don't know if I would describe it as Paleolithic emotions, but in a lot of my point was that technology is designed without considering everyone. It's designed only with certain narrow assumptions of normalcy, of what kinds of people use technologies. And when it is only considered so normalcy from a very kind of self-centered perspective, then you miss out, and everyone misses out. And my goal here is that for developers, but also just the way we understand technology, the way that we talk about technology, is to widen that perspective and widen what we think of as normal in terms of use of technology.
And I think in some ways, just to kind of pick up on that.
The mic a bit closer.
Oh, I'm
to
sorry.
you.
I think in some ways, just to pick up on that, I mean, oftentimes people think technology is going to correct the errors of human behavior and decision-making. I mean, we suck at decision-making. We have these theories, sorry, Vivian, but of rational decision-making in economics and elsewhere, and we know from psychology, right? That's why it's so interesting to have sort of a multidisciplinary panel here. We know that that's just not how it works. Like, we don't make rational, well-reasoned decisions under most circumstances. And I think people see technology as sort of our escape from that. And I think what I heard today, and what I believe is true, is you can't escape that, because humans are still developing the technology and they're using the technology. So the technology itself is agnostic, it's non-normative, it just is, right? But you still have the human inputs and outputs that are gonna replicate the same biases, the same limitations, the same narrowness of thinking, unless we do it differently. So I think technology can be helpful in some respects, but I think it's still subject to the limitations of human beings.
Yeah. We often look to technology to solve our problems instead of helping us solve them. And when that happens, we become, technology drives us rather than the other way around. And
So-
that happens a lot.
So it's interesting, BMW used to have the slogan, the ultimate driving machine. And now they're kind of being threatened with autonomous vehicles. So they changed their slogan, and the new slogan is, don't be driven by technology, drive it.
There you go.
I think that's what you're saying, essentially. And we're allowing ourselves to be driven by technology.
I didn't realize I was quoting an automobile ad, but that is kind of what I'm saying.
Looks like BMW
from
figured
them.
it
I
out.
use it now because I think
Yes,
it's
technology sometimes does solve our problems more or less all by itself, but too often, if we leave it up to technology rather than how to harness it, that's when we run into trouble.
I think
So
that's a good.
my response to your quote is, imagine one.
For those who don't know,
Certainly not
Imagine
the
One is
technology
a
of God.
fancy marketing name for an Oracle, what is it called, resource management system that the Rice University has adopted in the summer of 2021, and we are still struggling how to operate the university with this system. So I call it Nightmare One.